Okay, I want to go over a few things with the more complicated still life image that we're looking at right now. So there's 3 or 4 things to really watch out for. In addition to making sure your measurements are correct, making sure your bottle is built symmetrically, making sure you're being careful with how you construct these drawings, there are some things specific to light and shadow that I want to look at and want to make sure I've pointed out so that you can see them in the drawing and manipulate them in the drawing to good effect. So the first thing is just a reminder not to let your reflected light get too light. So I'm going to use this little square with the slot and circle cut in it so that we can see the values a little more effectively in this sphere. And what I want to point out is just to take a look. If I line this circle of this up with the light side of this sphere, so let's zoom in. So I'm going to come out here in the light of the sphere. If I look at the light through that circle, it looks lighter than the gray that's around it, which is about middle way between white and black. So it looks like it belongs higher up, maybe up here in the lighter side of this gradient. And that's right, it does. That's the light side. But if I look at this reflected light down here, this glow, this is something that we easily get wrong. If I put this in that same spot, notice how dark it is. Notice how it looks like it belongs down here, down below in the shadow. Even though if I look at it, oh, it seems to be glowing. If I get rid of the context of the ball and just look at that value by itself, it looks darker, like it belongs down here closer to the black. And it does because it's in the shadow. So don't let that happen in your drawing where you make this reflected light area the same value or lighter than this light area out here. It's all about context. So out here, the light, see that circle looks light, belongs higher in the light area. Here, circle is darker, belongs lower in the shadow area, even though they look similar when we look at them without this square. So just know that your eyes are fooling you. I want to show you that in this image. If I look at, let's say, the chin here of this face, you might be like, oh, it's glowing a little bit, so I'm going to add white charcoal or I'm going to erase back to the paper. But if I look at it, it's darker than the surroundings. It appears like it belongs down here. Whereas if I go out into the light part of the chin, notice how it looks like it belongs up higher. Same goes for this lip area right here. That's still quite a lot darker than middle gray, which is where I have this circle cut into. Let's look at this skull, that little glowing part in the shadow of that skull. Again, it maybe belongs just a little bit darker. This part of the shadow as well. If I go out into the light, now it belongs way higher, way up here. So beware of that. Be careful with that. Another way to do that, maybe, let's pick on this image. If I take this that looks like a glowing sort of light part of the shadow, and if I pull it into the light at all, you can immediately see how dark it is compared to the light. It's quite a bit darker than the light. That rule of thumb is everything in the shadow is darker than anything in the light. If you can keep that up, then your value structure is going to make a lot more sense. Your drawing is going to seem a lot more consistent. You're going to show us the forms better. So that's the first thing. Don't let your reflected light get out of hand. The second thing has to do with cast shadows, and I want to point this out on the sphere first. The thing about cast shadows is the closer they are to the object casting them, the sharper the edge appears to be, and kind of the darker they are as well. So if I look at the trip from this shadow edge here to where the cast shadow is landing, that's about the distance there to that edge to where its shadow hits the table. If I do the same thing up here from that edge roughly to there, you can see that's a much longer distance. And what happens over that distance is that the light has more time to spill around the edges of the object, especially if your light source is close to the object, like a lamp or something. And you get this blur happening. So you'll notice that the cast shadow here, as it's closer to the ball, is a bit sharper and maybe a bit darker. And out here, that cast shadow blurs out. You can capitalize on that in your drawing. You can make that happen in your drawing to really nice effect. So if I look at this, I see that happening a little bit right through here. The shadow seems sharper right here where it's close to the skull. And then it seems to blur up just a little bit by the time it gets to this box. What I can do as the artist is go, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to blur this shadow edge right there. And here I'm just using the blur tool in Photoshop. So that will add some clarity down here to the teeth and a sense of the shadow and light source out here. That's something that you can play with in your drawing, and it gives it a good sense of atmosphere, maybe kind of a blur effect to it. We can see it again happening here in the chin. A nice tight shadow down here underneath. By the time we get over here, it starts to blur up a little. Until we get to the edge here, it's rather blurry. And as I said, we can really play that up. We can make that cast shadow blurrier the further from the object it is, and just heighten that effect. I encourage you to look at a chain link fence sometime in the sun. You'll see the shadow of that chain link fence down at the ground where it's closer to the ground. The shadow is quite clear. And as you get further up the chain link fence in the shadow, it starts to blur out a lot more. It's that same effect happening. The light is spilling past the chain link fence, making it appear blurrier the further away it is from the actual fence. So the farther the shadow gets from the object casting it, the blurrier it becomes. And that's something to remember in your drawing that can really help the sense of atmosphere. Another very important thing is going to be the difference between hard and soft edges. You need both of them. And I'm going to pick on this face, for instance, because it shows it really well. If I make all of the edges in this face blurry, so I don't have any sharp edges, by sharp edge, I mean this kind of edge here. See how it's a quick trip from light to shadow. It's kind of a hard border, as opposed to down here in the chin where it's very gradual. If I make them all gradual, I get this, right? I get a blurry face. There's no clarity whatsoever. And that's not very satisfying to look at. Likewise, if I did everything sharp, it would be like a flat poster image. It wouldn't be very interesting to look at. It's the play between the hard edge and the soft edge that really helps sell the three-dimensional feel of this face. So look for places there are hard edges, and I'll do some of those in pink here. There's a hard edge there. There's a hard edge all the way there. There's a hard edge there. There's a hard edge down here at the bottom of this shadow. There's a somewhat of a hard edge there, though it's not quite as hard as the other ones. And let's look at some of the soft edges. There's a soft edge. There's a soft edge. This is the border between light and shadow. Very soft through here. Very soft down there. Somewhat soft there. Oh, there's a hard edge kind of there. Hard-ish. The hardest edges are those cast shadow edges right there, and through there. There's a pretty hard edge along that side of the face, all the way. Pretty much the silhouette of this object is going to be a relatively hard edge. So remember that. Look for soft edges, look for hard edges. It's important that you have both of those in your drawing. So in this face, it's the hard edge here against the soft edge above it that gives us this lip turning into shadow. Then we get a little reflected light, but it's not too light. It's not as light as this light out here, right? It's all of that stuff. You're considering each of those individual things when doing this drawing. That leads me to probably the final thing that I'm going to talk about, and that's lines versus borders. It's very tempting to come through in a drawing like this and say, let's put a line here and a line there. And lines everywhere. There's a line here. There's a line here. You're just drawing lines all over the place. But what I would say is look instead in terms of borders between light and shadow. So for instance, up here, what we might put a dark line there for, I would suggest is not a line at all. Shouldn't have a line at all. It's a border. It's a shadow shape here against a light shape there, with kind of a fuzzy, but not too fuzzy border between them. If you draw this big shadow shape, this big light shape, and fuzz the border between them after filling this shadow shape in, and deal with borders instead of lines, your object will be much clearer, much more visually convincing. The only place that lines make much sense at all is in these tight shadows. So I could see a line that gets thicker and thinner coming right off of the bottom of that chin. These thin shadows in the box, those might make good places for lines. The cracks in the skull, though I would say a nice irregular line. You don't want it to be smooth because this skull is not smooth. I might edit out all of these incidental. There's a ton of little cracks and stuff. I'd edit all of those out and just get the most obvious ones in your drawing. That's a good place for some lines. some come and go lines, some hit and miss lines. So think about borders instead of lines for everything. Okay, let's recap things to watch out for when drawing a setup like this, particularly having to do with light and shadow. So of course you're going to gesture to make sure you see where it's going to land on the page. Of course you're going to measure and block things in as proportional as you can. So you're measuring, checking width against height and all of that. When you get to the value, here's the stuff to remember. 1, don't let your reflected light get too light. It belongs in the shadow. It should be dark like the shadow. The only way it shows up as a glowing thing is that the stuff around it, the core shadow and other parts of the shadow, are just darker still. 2, when looking at cast shadows, think about how close to the object they are. If they're close to the object, they're going to be tight and sharp-edged. As they get further from that object, you can blur that edge to increase the sense of atmosphere and the feel of the light source. 3, hard and soft edges. You need both of them. Look at the edge of the shadow or light that you are drawing and ask yourself, is that a hard edge, meaning it goes very abruptly from light to shadow? Or is that a soft edge? Does it go gradually from light to shadow? If it goes gradually from light to shadow, how gradually? Is it really smooth? Is it really gradual? Or is it somewhat soft, somewhat gradual? The final thing is lines versus borders. It's a good idea to go through your drawing and look for lines that are jumping out at you and ask yourself, here I've put a line. Why did I put that line there? Does a line make sense there? Would this look better if I turned it into a border between light and shadow instead by maybe darkening the shadow or easing that line out of existence, maybe erasing the line and bringing the shadow information up to the light information and playing with that border between the two instead? And that can really enhance the sense that we're looking at something the way we look at it in real life, because we don't go around real life looking at everything with lines all over them. We look at borders and differences and light and shadow. And so that's what we're thinking about when drawing something like this. And those are the 4 things I wanted to cover in this before you start into this drawing.